The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling and Associates, casting long shadows across the marble lobby. Sarah Martinez adjusted her blazer and checked her watch. 6:30 a.m., just like every other morning. For the past 3 years, the building was silent, except for the gentle hum of the elevators and the distant sound of the cleaning crew finishing their work on the upper floors. Sarah had always been the first to arrive. She liked the quiet, the way her footsteps echoed softly in the empty hallways, the peaceful moments before the chaos of another corporate day began. As she walked toward the elevator, her reflection caught in the polished marble walls a young woman in her late 20s, professionally dressed, carrying herself with quiet confidence despite her modest title. Executive assistant. Those two words had defined her professional life for 3 years now, though they hardly captured the reality of what she did every day. Sarah was the invisible engine that kept Sterling and Associates running smoothly. She managed schedules, coordinated meetings, handled client relations, and somehow always managed to anticipate problems before they arose. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Sarah stepped inside, pressing the button for the 32nd floor. As the elevator climbed, she thought about the day ahead. There was the quarterly board meeting at 10, 3 client calls to coordinate, and a presentation to finalize for the Henderson account. Just another typical Tuesday in her carefully orchestrated world. But today would be different. Today, everything would change. Sarah had learned long ago that being an assistant meant being invisible. People talked around her as if she weren't there, shared confidential information in her presence without a second thought, made decisions that affected entire departments while she sat quietly in the corner, taking notes they assumed no one would ever read. They had no idea how much she saw, how much she understood, or how much she had been quietly documenting for the past 3 years. Her office, though calling it an office, was generous, as it was more of a glorified cubicle adjacent to the CEO's suite, was exactly as she had left it the night before. Pristine, organized, with everything in its proper place. Sarah had always prided herself on her attention to detail, her ability to anticipate needs, her unwavering professionalism, even in the most challenging situations. And there had been many challenging situations with Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling was the kind of CEO who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. Tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they encountered. He had built Sterling and Associates from the ground up, turning a small consulting firm into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that dominated the market. He was also, Sarah had learned through careful observation, a man who believed his success gave him the right to treat people however he pleased. Sarah began her morning routine brewing coffee in the small kitchen area, checking emails, reviewing the day's schedule. She had perfected this dance over 3 years, moving with quiet efficiency through tasks that most people never noticed, but that kept the entire executive floor functioning. At 7:15, she heard the familiar sound of Richard's arrival. His voice carried down the hallway as he spoke loudly into his phone, probably already conducting business before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Sarah straightened her shoulders and prepared for another day of serving someone who had never once acknowledged her contributions beyond the most basic pleasantries. Sarah. Richard's voice boomed from his office. Where's my coffee? And I need the Morrison files, and call Henderson, tell them we're moving the meeting to this afternoon. Good morning, Mr. Sterling, Sarah replied calmly, already moving toward his office with his coffee exactly how he liked it, strong and black with just a hint of cream. The Morrison files are on your desk, and I'll call Henderson right away. Richard barely glanced up from his computer screen. This was their daily interaction, him barking orders, her executing them flawlessly, neither of them acknowledging that she had anticipated most of his needs before he even voiced them. The morning passed in its usual blur of activity. Calls were made, meetings were scheduled, problems were solved before they could become crises. Sarah moved through it all with practiced grace. The invisible force that kept Richard Sterling's world turning smoothly. At 9:30, she began preparing for the quarterly board meeting. This was always a tense event, of the most powerful people in the industry gathering to discuss strategy, finances, and the future direction of the company. Sarah had attended dozens of these meetings, sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes, ensuring everyone had what they needed. Today's meeting was particularly important. The company was considering a major acquisition, a deal that could either propel Sterling and Associates to new heights or potentially destabilize everything Richard had built. Sarah had spent weeks preparing materials, coordinating schedules, ensuring every detail was perfect. The boardroom was an impressive space, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, with windows overlooking the city skyline. Sarah had arrived early to set up, ensuring that each board member's materials were perfectly arranged, that the presentation equipment was working flawlessly, that the coffee service was ready. One by one, the board members arrived. Sarah knew them all by now, their preferences, their personalities, their individual quirks. There was Margaret Chen, the sharp-eyed CFO, who never missed a detail. David Rodriguez, the marketing director, who always wore colorful ties and had a habit of tapping his pen when he was thinking. Jennifer Walsh, the legal counsel, who spoke in measured tones and seemed to see 3 moves ahead in every conversation. They filed into the room, exchanging pleasantries, settling into their chairs with the casual confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. Richard entered last, as he always did, commanding attention without saying a word. He took his place at the head of the table, and Sarah settled into her usual spot in the corner, notebook ready, practically invisible to the powerful people around the table. The meeting began routinely enough. Financial reports were reviewed, market projections were discussed, strategies were debated. Sarah took notes, occasionally fetching additional documents or adjusting the presentation slides when requested. Then they reached the topic of the Henderson acquisition. This was the deal Richard had been pursuing for months, a smaller firm with valuable client relationships and innovative processes that could significantly expand Sterling and Associates' capabilities. It was also a deal that Sarah knew more about than anyone realized. As Richard began his presentation, outlining the benefits of the acquisition, Sarah noticed Margaret Chen frowning slightly. David Rodriguez was tapping his pen more rapidly than usual. There was tension in the room, a sense that something was about to go wrong. The Henderson acquisition represents a unique opportunity, Richard was saying, his voice full of confidence. Their client base aligns perfectly with our growth strategy, and their innovative approaches could revolutionize how we deliver services. Margaret Chen cleared her throat. Richard, I've been reviewing the financials, and I have some concerns. About Henderson's debt structure, there are some irregularities that weren't apparent in the initial analysis. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah had seen this expression before the moment when Richard Sterling realized that something wasn't going according to his plan. I'm confident in our analysis, Richard replied, his tone becoming slightly sharp. We've done extensive due diligence. Actually, Jennifer Walsh interjected, I've identified some potential legal issues with their recent contracts. Nothing insurmountable, but significant enough to require careful consideration. The mood in the room was shifting. Sarah could feel the tension building, could see the way Richard's hands were gripping his coffee cup just a little too tightly. David Rodriguez leaned forward. Richard, maybe we should consider postponing the acquisition until we can address these concerns more thoroughly. That's when Richard snapped. Postpone. His voice rose sharply. We've been working on this for months. Every detail has been carefully planned and executed. He turned toward Sarah, his eyes flashing with anger. This is exactly the kind of incompetence I'm talking about. You were supposed to ensure all the materials were perfect, that every possible issue was identified and addressed. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice steady. Mr. Sterling, all the materials you requested were prepared. Exactly as specified. The concerns the board is raising don't make excuses. Richard's voice was now loud enough that everyone in the room was staring. You're nothing but a worthless assistant. You can't even handle basic research without missing critical details. Before Sarah could respond, Richard grabbed his coffee cup still half full of hot coffee and, in a moment of rage, hurled it directly at her face. The room fell completely. Silent. Sarah felt the hot coffee splash across her cheek and shoulder, staining her professional blazer, burning her skin slightly. For a moment, time seemed suspended. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her, could see the shock and horror on the faces of the board members. Margaret Chen gasped audibly. David Rodriguez dropped his pen. Jennifer Walsh's mouth fell open. But Sarah didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. She didn't run from the room in tears or humiliation. Instead, she stood up slowly, with a calmness that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including herself. She reached into her briefcase, the same briefcase she had carried to every meeting for 3 years, and pulled out her phone. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice clear and steady. There's something you need to know. Richard was still breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger. What are you talking about? Get out of my boardroom. Sarah looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. For the past 3 years, I've been more than just an assistant. I've been documenting every meeting, every conversation, every decision made in this company. She held up her phone. I've been recording everything. The silence in the room became even more profound. But more importantly, Sarah continued, I've also been pursuing my MBA in business administration at night, specializing in corporate strategy and acquisitions. I graduated last month, summa cum laude. Margaret Chen's eyebrows rose. David Rodriguez leaned forward with interest. I've spent 3 years learning this business from the inside, Sarah said, her confidence growing with each word. I know our clients better than anyone because I've been the one actually managing their relationships. I know our processes, our strengths, our weaknesses. She turned to face Richard directly. And I know about the Henderson acquisition because I'm the one who identified them as a target in the first place. The research you've been presenting to the board. I did that research. The financial analysis. I prepared it. The strategic recommendations. Those came from my work. Richard's face was now pale instead of flushed. That's not true. Sarah smiled slightly. Would you like me to play some of the recordings where you're asking me to put together some ideas about potential acquisitions? Or perhaps the conversations where you're discussing strategy with clients while I'm sitting right there, taking notes you assumed no one would ever review. She looked around the table again. The concerns you've raised about Henderson are valid. In fact, I identified those same issues weeks ago and tried to bring them to Mr. Sterling's attention. He dismissed them because, as he just demonstrated, he doesn't believe assistants have anything valuable to contribute. Margaret Chen was now looking at Sarah with obvious interest. You identified the debt structure issues and the legal problems with their contracts, Sarah replied, nodding toward Jennifer Walsh. I prepared detailed reports on both issues. They're in the supplemental materials I provided to Mr. Sterling last week. Richard looked panicked. This is insubordination. Sarah, you're fired. Actually, said Margaret Chen, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension. I think we need to hear more about these reports. For the next hour, Sarah presented her analysis of the Henderson acquisition, not as an assistant taking dictation, but as a strategist who had spent 3 years studying the company from every angle. She outlined the risks, proposed solutions, and suggested alternative approaches that could address the board's concerns while still achieving the strategic objectives. The board members listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, engaging with her ideas in a way that Richard had never done in 3 years of working together. When Sarah finished her presentation, Margaret Chen was the first to speak. This is exactly the kind of thorough analysis we needed, she said. Sarah, what are your career plans? Sarah straightened her shoulders. I was planning to give my notice next week, actually. I've been accepted into a strategic consulting role at Morrison & Associates. David Rodriguez whistled softly. Morrison & Associates was one of Sterling's biggest competitors. Wait, Jennifer Walsh interjected. Before we let you walk out that door, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your future here at Sterling. Richard found his voice. She's just an assistant. You can't seriously be considering Mr. Sterling, Margaret Chen interrupted, her tone icy. I think you should step outside while we continue this discussion. Richard's face cycled through several emotions: disbelief, panic. This is my company. You can't, actually, Jennifer Walsh said quietly. According to the corporate governance documents, the board has the authority to make personnel decisions that are in the best interest of the company. And right now, I think what's best for the company is to hear what Sarah has to say about her vision for Sterling & Associates' future. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah found herself in a conversation she had never imagined possible. The board members wanted to know her thoughts on company strategy, her ideas for improving client relationships, her assessment of market opportunities. They discussed the Henderson acquisition in detail, ultimately deciding to proceed, but with modifications, based on Sarah's recommendations. They talked about organizational structure, about the importance of recognizing and developing talent at every level of the company. When Richard was finally called back into the room, it was to hear Margaret Chen deliver a message he clearly hadn't expected. "The board has made several decisions," she announced. "First, the Henderson acquisition will proceed, but with significant modifications to address the concerns Sarah identified. Second, we're creating a new position, Director of Strategic Development. We're offering it to Sarah." Richard's mouth opened and closed without sound. "Third," Margaret continued, "we're implementing a comprehensive review of management practices and company culture. The behavior we witnessed today is unacceptable and will not be tolerated." Sarah looked at Richard, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in 3 years. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own actions and their consequences. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said quietly, "I'll accept the position on one condition. I want to implement a mentorship program for administrative staff, helping them develop their skills and advance their careers. Too many talented people are overlooked simply because of their job titles." Margaret Chen smiled. "I think that's an excellent idea." 6 months later, Sarah sat in her new office, a real office this time, with windows and a door and her name on a plaque outside. The mentorship program had been a tremendous success, with 3 former assistants already promoted to management positions. The Henderson acquisition had gone through smoothly, exactly as she had recommended. The company was thriving, and the board had noted an improvement in both employee satisfaction and client retention. Richard Sterling was still CEO, but his role had been significantly modified. He now reported directly to the board on personnel matters, and he had been required to attend extensive management training. More importantly, the culture of the company had begun to shift. People were listening to each other differently, recognizing that good ideas could come from anywhere, and that treating employees with respect wasn't just morally right, it was good business. Sarah kept the recording of that board meeting on her phone, though she had never needed to use it. Sometimes she would listen to it, not out of spite, but as a reminder of how much had changed, and how quickly circumstances could shift when someone finally decided to stand up for themselves. The coffee stain had been impossible to remove from her blazer, so she had donated it to charity and bought herself a new one read this time. Instead of the safe navy blue she had worn for 3 years, she kept a photo from that day on her desk, not of the confrontation, but of her first board presentation as Director of Strategic Development. In it, she's standing confidently at the front of the room, presenting ideas to colleagues who were listening with respect and engagement. Looking at that photo, Sarah often reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this place. 3 years of invisibility, of being overlooked and underestimated, had taught her things that no MBA program could have provided. She had learned patience, observation, and the value of quiet preparation, but most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up and speak your truth, especially when everyone expects you to remain silent. The coffee incident, as it came to be known around the office, had become something of a legend. New employees would hear the story and understand immediately that Sterling and Associates was the kind of place where talent was recognized regardless of title, where good ideas were valued regardless of their source. Sarah Martinez had learned that being invisible had its advantages, but being seen, truly seen, was infinitely more powerful. and she never intended to be invisible again.